Along with some of you, I think I just came back from the EDUCAUSE conference last week, and there was an awful lot of discussion of different kind of learning analytics things there. So what we're doing here is timely, even in the larger community, I would say. It's a real pleasure today to welcome today's guest, Anne Gere. Anne is the Gertrude Buck Collegiate Professor in the School of Education, the Arthur F. Thurnau Professor of English Language and Literature here in LS&A, the co-chair of the Joint Program in English and Education, the director of the Sweetland Writing Center, and one of my personal heroes. Few people combine the deep disciplinary expertise, passionate teaching, and really serious, effective service that Anne does. So I'm really pleased that we have her here at Michigan. She does so much more than just keep all these programs running. She's always innovating. It's not that often that someone who's directing a writing program is willing to try and quantify what's happening. So it's really exciting to have her here to talk about analytics in an area where it might seem difficult to apply. The title of her talk, Quantitative Measures of Writing Ability. Welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. I have to say that although I'm standing here at the podium, there is actually a throng of people that you should be imagining. First of all, my colleagues at Sweetland, some of whom are here, who have been enormously supportive in my efforts to introduce analytics into the way that we think about teaching and assessing writing. And so thanks to all of them. And thanks also to graduate students. One of the great pleasures, I think, of this academic life is to work with the next generation of scholars. And I've been really privileged to do that in the research that I've been doing, particularly in my work at the Sweetland Center. And so I'd like to thank Laura All, who is not here, who has gone on to be a professor elsewhere, as has Moises Perales, and Tim Green, and Ann Porter, and Zach Lancaster, and Christy Toth, who is here, and Justine Niederheiser, who are all currently students who are working with me in various capacities on pieces of this work. And so all of them are really speaking as part of what I have to say here today. So the first thing that I want to talk about a little bit is this very odd thing about higher education in this country, of which we take part, which is to say that on the one hand, in higher education, we're always talking about access, about opening our doors, and in the case of Michigan, to students from Michigan, to a diverse population, and so forth. And at the same time, we are also holding up standards of rigor. And one of the ways that we do that, I think, is in what we do with our matriculating students. So you get accepted to the University of Michigan, and then as part of your orientation, you are then vetted multiple times in mathematics, in foreign language, for many students in chemistry, and also in writing. And I simply want to put that out there as a kind of frame for much of what I'm talking about today, because in the case of writing at least, so much of the work that's been done in assessment has been driven by this necessity that seems to pervade higher education to, on the one hand, be accessible, and then on the other hand, to be very selective about students once we have them in higher education. And so the whole placement enterprise in writing, of course, is the one that I know best, but I'm aware that there is this placement energy going on in multiple places in the university, which when I think when we're thinking about learning analytics, we need to start at that place and think about what we're doing there and how that then plays out in the ways that learning occurs for students through the university. So at any rate, the writing placement being a key enterprise here. And for a student who's entering the university, there are really three choices of kinds of courses. There is ELI 120, which is for students who are largely international. There is Writing 100, which is called Transition to College Writing, and this is where I'm going to be spending quite a bit of my time talking today, and then there are multiple courses. I'm filling in some of this because I assume for many of you, knowing about the roots in writing is probably not the most familiar thing. There are actually 7 ways that students can fulfill the writing requirement within LS&A. You can do it in Slavic and comparative literature and history and classics and a residential college and honors and English and so on. Which for many people is a little bit confusing, that there are that many different places where one can go to fulfill this first-year writing requirement. So that's the array of choices that students are faced with when they come to the university. Now, I mentioned this issue of placement. I think it's also important for you to have a little bit of sense of history. This enterprise of placement that I was talking about goes on at this university and virtually every university across the country. And in writing, at least, there has been a sort of historical succession of shifting practices that I think are important for you to know about as well. That is, prior to the early 1980s, there was what was called indirect measures of writing. That is, people weren't actually asked to write anything for placement. They were asked to do multiple choice tests. And in many places, that is still the norm. So everything that I'm going to say about change has to be tempered by the fact that some institutions are still doing some other version that this university has moved beyond. But at this university, like many, there was this period where indirect measures were the norm. That gave way as research in the field moved into more concern about and attention to processes of writing. And so with that came the impromptu essay, which was then scored holistically, because once you move away from the short answer question, there's the whole question of how you're going to score, especially if you're scoring writing. So holistic scoring, which basically means multiple people, usually 2, read the same piece of writing, decide on its quality, usually using some kind of a scoring guide and numerical indicators. And if there's a disagreement of more than 1 point, then a third reader comes in and that score becomes the way that the essays are judged. That, in turn, here gave way in 1994 to a brief period of portfolio assessment, where students who matriculated at the university had to, as part of their orientation and entrance, present a portfolio of their writing in high school. And that, too, was scored by multiple readers, usually 2. And again, using a system that was roughly holistic, but of course the difference was that they were looking not at a piece of essentially impromptu writing, but a compendium of student work that extended often across multiple years and certainly multiple kinds of writing. In 1998, this university and many others moved to a system called directed self-placement. And that is a system that basically gives students a series of questions. So, for example, between 2000 and 2005, these were the questions. And if you can't see them, let me just say that 2 of them, at least, focus very much on reading newspapers, reading periodicals, reading at least 4 books of different genres. There's also some information requested here about class standing in high school, ACT or SAT verbals, and then a little bit about some sense of themselves as writers. So on the basis of these questions and the ways that they answered them, students were expected to choose whether they would take ELI 120 or Sweetland 100 or a course that meets the first-year writing requirement. And that was the system that existed from 1998 continues to exist, but in a modified form that I'll tell you a little bit more about. In 2006, this scoring system, this questionnaire system was changed. And if you look at these questions, they're remarkably different from the ones, and I have no knowledge of what caused, this was before I had anything to do with Sweetland, so I have no idea why the questions were changed and what that was all about. But they did change very dramatically. You do still have one question about reading, but it's simply reading frequently with no particular specification of either genre or quantity. And you have several questions that emphasize confidence or comfort. I am confident about my ability. I'm comfortable writing papers, comfortable with classes and other than English, comfortable with standard English. So that's a pretty significant change when you think about what the questions looked like before, what they look like here. So what happens, I think, is pretty interesting. You get a very big drop-off between 05 and 06 when these new questions are introduced in terms of the numbers of students who are being recommended to take Sweetland 100, or what is now called Writing 100. So in 2008 is when I became director, and so that's the world that I came into, a world where directed self-placement was the norm. Students were basically being asked to answer these questions, and on the basis of that make a decision about what they should do. So it seemed to me, especially looking at this data, that there was something very funny going on here, that all of a sudden the population at the University of Michigan hadn't changed that dramatically, that clearly the questions must have had something to do with this shift. And I was also concerned because when I began looking at data, what we did was look at SAT scores, SAT verbals, in relation to the way that students performed in first-year writing. We also looked at SAT writing scores because you remember starting in 2005, the SAT added a writing component as well as the standard verbal exam, and so we looked at that. We looked at high school GPA, and in every case, what we could see was a pretty good correlation, statistically speaking, between what students were doing either in their high school experience and or tests and the ways that they were performing in first year writing. But it was complicated because in no case was a single student wholly one thing. That is, you could have a student who would have a rather low high school GPA, but rather high scores, or the reverse, or some combination of that. So one of the things that made me concerned was that it's very easy to sort of dismiss students and say, well, this one is a, quote, basic writer, and this one is not. But in fact, there wasn't compelling evidence for that because they were often this sort of mixed picture. So what we were able to say was that the students in general who fell into these categories, that is of a 3.3 or less GPA in high school, the 520 on the writing score, in the SAT, the verbal 520, or the ACT 23, that at this university, those are the students who are performing least well in first year writing. Now again, if you think about the larger population, and this gets back to this sort of access rigor piece, many universities would be thrilled to have students performing at this level, and these would be the very best students in many places. So this whole issue of how we are thinking about students is obviously very institution specific. And I think that says something about how we have to think about analytics then, that national norms aren't necessarily very useful when we start thinking about what's going on in this institution with this particular population of students. So looking at all of this data and then thinking as a teacher about the number of times that I had encountered students who gave me some version of, you know, I was an A student in high school, why am I getting C's in English? And in some ways, I didn't have a very good answer for that question. There was also the problem of students who couldn't know what was expected of them, that college writing isn't like high school writing necessarily, but there was nothing in the process that they were going through that would give them any indication of what it was that they were answering these questions about. So when they say, I'm comfortable writing a paper of 4 or 5 pages, well, fine, but the kind of paper you're going to write in high school is quite different from the kind you're going to be writing in college, and how would students know that to make the best choices for themselves? So what we did was modify directed self-placement. So now every student who comes here reads an article, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. They write in response to a specific prompt, and they answer questions which we have also changed. So what we're trying to do is a couple of things. First of all, to give students an indication of what writing might look like here at the university. And I should say that part of what we were doing as we were developing this was to try to discern what is the kind of writing that students are most likely to be asked to do here. And we did this by looking at the learning objectives in first-year writing. We talked with faculty, and it's pretty clear that the evidence-based argument is what most faculty are expecting students to be able to do. It varies across field, naturally, but that's sort of the thing that people are being expected to do. And so it seemed then that what we should do is give students an opportunity to see that kind of writing requirement and to have to respond to it. And then at the same time to answer some questions. So that's how we modified the DSP. So in 2009 then, this was the first year that we implemented the new system. We had students read an article that was written by Malcolm Gladwell, appeared in the New Yorker late in 2008. And it was a piece that if you know Gladwell's work at all, well written, a little bit sophisticated, and it was basically an article in which he is predicting who's going to be a good teacher with who's going to be a good quarterback, and the difficulties of both of those things, that you can have people who are really good college quarterbacks, but when you get them into the NFL, they just can't do the job. And you can have really good prospective teachers who turn out just not to be very good teachers. And interesting article. And then this was the prompt that students had to respond to, having read this article. And then here are the questions that they had to answer. And as you can see, part of what we were trying to do in these questions was to have them reflect on a real experience that they had just had, that is, writing the essay in this case, so that they would not be thinking in abstract terms. And another thing that we were trying to accomplish, frankly, was simply to raise the stakes of writing on this campus. That it seemed to me if students were coming in and spending an hour on a math test and an hour on a foreign language test, potentially an hour on a chemistry test, and maybe 10 minutes answering 7 questions about writing, that was sending a message about how we value writing on this campus. And so the linkage of these questions to the experience of writing was another way of sort of reinforcing that this actually matters. So as a result of that, we sort of stopped and said, okay, so what's happened? Having done this for the first time, you might have expected that there would have been an enormous increase in the number of students who elected Sweetland 100. That didn't happen, which I actually thought was a good thing. What we had was a treasure trove, because the way that we had students do these essays was online. They had to do them on C-tools, because my theory was that this is a system they're going to have to negotiate when they come to the university anyway. Let's give them this opportunity to get familiar with the system, and then we will have all of these essays online, which is exactly what we have. And then the next piece was, because my feeling about assessment is that the best assessment is always connected to instruction. And so what we've done is arrange that every essay that a student writes goes to his or her instructor in the first writing course that they take, whatever that is. And so the instructors, when the course opens, get this folder with the essays written by students, which they are then encouraged to incorporate into their own instruction. We also did some follow-up looking to see what else was going on here. And we found that there weren't really dramatic changes. It looked as if students with slightly higher SAT scores were enrolling in Sweetland 100. Slightly lower SAT scores were enrolling, but of course you have to remember that a larger percentage of students at this university are taking the ACT rather than the SAT, and so not necessarily, we'd have to do some more study to see what these numbers really mean. Also wanted to look at the GPAs of students, and there too, not a lot of change. So then the next thing that we wanted to do was sort of look at this question of consequential validity. I think for many of us, people outside sciences and places where statistics are the norm, it's easy to think of validity as just, are we measuring what we say we're measuring? And I have come to understand that validity is a much more complicated term than that, and certainly consequential validity, or the consequences that fall out of any assessment, are something that I think we institutionally need to pay attention to. So that was one of the things that we wanted to do. Another was, as I've already said, to make sure that any assessment that we built in was also going to connect to instruction. And finally, I mentioned this treasure trove of essays, that this seemed a resource where we could really do some interesting research. So that was sort of the next thing that we moved on to. So among other things, what we did were surveys of students to find out how they were perceiving the choices that they had made. And in this, as you can see, we asked them a lot of questions about what influenced their choices, and far and away, confidence was the biggest factor. Now, confidence obviously cuts two ways. They were either lacking in confidence or very confident, but in either event, confidence seemed to be the major thing that was helping students to make their decisions about what writing course to take. And that suggests another piece of work that I hope we will get to as time goes on, to understand more fully what that means, because in the writing field at least, confidence and competence are often linked in interesting ways, and I think that's something that needs to get teased out. So that's on the agenda. And similarly here, when students were asked to talk about the extent to which their level of confidence changed as a result of taking Sweetland 100, they were, as you can see, much more confident after having taken the course. So again, there's this relationship between confidence and presumably growing competence that I think is worth looking at. Another thing that we looked at was, again, sort of before we modified the DSP and after. And this is a piece that I think we, again, don't fully understand, but it's a very interesting piece, that the gender makeup of Sweetland 100 has shifted a little bit, that it was more female-dominated than it currently is. And what has been the effect of this change in that lineup. I'm not sure yet, but that's something we're going to look at. We also looked at ethnicity, not anything very dramatic there, slightly more representation of students of color, but not dramatic. Similarly, we looked at family income and were there any changes there, not again much. Parental levels of education, a little bit of change, but not very much. We also looked at neighborhood clusters, and I'm not sure that everyone in the room knows what neighborhood clusters are. This is a set of descriptors that the College Board has produced and admissions uses, and so it's data that any of you could have access to be able to look at students in terms of a set of descriptors about their background. And so I'm just going to read you one to give you an idea. So for example, cluster 7 was one that increased in this shift in 2008. And so the neighborhood cluster for number 7 says, college-bound students who perform very well within their high school on standardized tests. They tend to target more selective private institutions with strong pre-professional programs. What distinguishes them from students in other clusters is their strong interest in leadership. This factor, combined with strong writing skills and a tendency toward arts and sciences, makes them likely candidates for legal and public service careers. Parents are typically middle class and are interested in financial aid. High schools tend to be smaller and predominantly public. So that's the descriptor, and then you get a bunch of numbers. So mean math SAT is 570, mean verbal is 568, and so on. So we were looking at that because, as you probably know, at this university, neighborhood clusters are often a proxy for other features that we are not allowed, like race, to look at in admissions. So it seemed to us another source of interesting data. This is what the representation of these neighborhood clusters looks like, and you can get the full description of the many neighborhood clusters that our students come from. So as I said earlier, the other thing that we wanted to be sure was to build this linkage with instruction. And so not only do instructors of first-year writing get copies of the essays that their students have written, they also get a full packet of materials, including a lot of suggestions about how they can incorporate that piece of writing into instruction in the course. And this is just a sampling of the kinds of things that they are given. So now on to talk about the treasure trove, about this collection of essays that we have. So basically, if you imagine this great pool of all of them, they then break down into these 4 categories. There are the students who went first into Writing 100, the developmental course. There are the students who went directly into English, first-year writing English course, or first-year writing course. There are the students who went into an ELI course for whom English is probably a second language, and there are the students who are simply trying to evade the requirement altogether. And so we haven't tracked all of them down, but we have about 3,000 each year now. So now we have 6,000. We're going on to our 9,000s. And that's the body of material that we're looking at. So we decided to focus on 2 groups, the group of the students who signed up for the developmental course and the students who went straight into first-year writing. And you can see we're talking about big numbers here, and for the kind of work that we're doing, that's really nice to have. So basically, we're doing 2 kinds of analysis. One is more qualitative and one is more quantitative, and putting them together. And so the first thing I'm going to talk about is the qualitative piece, which is called move analysis, which is basically a way of looking at a piece of writing to try to understand what the student is doing rhetorically, what rhetorical moves the student is making. And so the way we did this was to, first of all, read the prompt again and again, the prompt that I showed you about writing in response to the Gladwell essay. And then read very closely. We focus just on the introductions because all the research shows that in an argument, particularly an evidence-based argument, usually the introduction is going to give you a sense of where the whole essay is going to go, that the major rhetorical moves are going to show up in that introduction. And so that's where we focused. And so the strategy was to read these introductions very carefully and try to discern what it was that students were doing. And so there's no guidebook to follow for this. It is something where you literally are plunged into reading the text carefully. So again, I should say that I am a woman on a mission. In writing, most assessment has been driven by what I would call the psychometric paradigm. That is, most of the energy in writing assessment has been driven by people with a background in educational measurement. And so there's been a lot of worry about statistical results and inter-rater reliability and validity and that sort of thing. And I'm certainly not saying that those aren't important things, but almost to the detriment of paying any attention to the actual writing. And so what we're trying to do is to really focus on the writing and say, after all, that's what we're talking about. So anyway, spent a lot of time reading, and the way we did it was to read in pairs and compare notes and talk about what we were seeing, and eventually came up with what seemed pretty clearly to be the three moves that students were making. On the one hand, they were doing what we call this background move, where they're basically saying something about the topic in general. Then there was this review move, where they referred directly to the Gladwell essay, either through summarizing it and or evaluating it. And so, for example, whoops, sorry, I didn't need to do that. I wanted to read you an example here. So, for example, a background sentence could be something like, teaching capabilities and football dexterity are not normally two abilities that are seen together. So that's a kind of background statement. And a review statement could be, if only I could get this computer to do what I want it to do. Where is Steve when I need him? Well, anyway, I'll make it up. So a review move would be Gladwell compares quarterbacks with teachers. And a review with an evaluation would be Gladwell is very enthusiastic about the way that we can think about sports in relation to English. So we looked at those, and then the third move is the stand, where the person is actually taking a position, agreeing or disagreeing with what Gladwell is proposing. So basically, we read essays, identified these moves, and then came up with what we would describe as canonical criteria, the things that make this an evidence-based argument for this prompt. And so one of them is typicality, and that it clearly addresses the prompt. And then of the three moves that I mentioned, the background move, the review move, and the stand move, two of them are obligatory. You have to review, you have to say something about what Gladwell has written about, and you also have to take a position, which makes sense rhetorically. I mean, that's what an argument is, after all, is looking at a body of information and taking a position in relation to it. So it made sense rhetorically, but it also was exactly what students were doing. So what we found was that among the students who went directly into first-year writing, there was a significantly higher percentage who were writing essays that would fit that canonical pattern, and proportionately fewer students going into the 100. So again, it confirmed that the students were making choices that were appropriate for them, that the students who were less able to write this evidence-based argument were actually in the right place, that this was the course that they ought to be taking. So then the next thing that we did is the quantitative part, which is using computers to look at the language of the whole body of the material. And so what I want to do first is just give you a quick overview. So we were looking at references and citations. We were looking at evidentials of deduction. We were looking at countering and formal hedges. And the reasons that we were looking at those things was because that's what we had seen in our qualitative reading of the text. And what we found was that those kinds of things that I've just named were more common in the writing of the students who took first-year writing immediately. They made many fewer of the personal references, which turned out to be much more dominant in the writing of students in 100. So what I'm going to do quickly is just show you some of the results that we found. In the case of references and citations, here we didn't find a huge difference, that both sets of students would make specific references to Gladwell, for example, and they would often, citation refers to quotation, and there would often be quotes in about equal proportion there. Code glosses are those kinds of language, like the kind that are represented here, which are very important if you think about it when you're trying to incorporate an argument from somebody else or information from somebody else. This kind of language is very useful for making that move. And this kind of language was significantly lower, as you can see, 20% versus 9%. The students who went into the developmental class were much less able to manage that kind of language. Evidentials of deduction, not as much difference, although if you look at just because and since, but if you look at words like hence, consequently, as a result, therefore, for this reason, the more academic register, if you will, again, stronger for the students who go into first year writing, less strong for the students who are going into 100. So again, it feels like they're making the right choice for themselves. Similarly, reporting verbs. So the ones that fall into a more academic register, like argues, discusses, claims. Again, first year writing students are doing better on those. Words like says, believes, and thinks show up much more prominently among the students who are in the 100 course. Hedges, the maybe, mights, and so forth, much more the common language, and particularly the introduction of I think, I believe, in my view, those kinds of things coming up much more strongly in the less able writers, and the more academic terms like perhaps, indicate, suggest, and so forth showing up much more prominently in the writing of the more able students. I mentioned this before, but the self-mentions, the personalized stance instead of depersonalizing, to put it in terms of I think, I believe, I strongly support, again, much higher in the 100 students than in the others. And finally, the use of boosters, which are those words that we use to intensify very much, extremely, totally, and so forth, much stronger for the students who are in the 100 course. So I just give you that very quickly to give a sense of the kind of thing that we can tease out of this corpus of student writing, and to see that in every case, this kind of assessment, this kind of learning analytic, if you will, gives us direct instruction for what to do in our classes. That we now know a set of things about what kind of help students need to develop arguments. Since the evidence-based argument is something they're all going to need to be able to do, we know some things that they need help with. We need we also know some things that we can tell them quite explicitly about what academic register looks like and the kind of language that is often more prized within the university, and to make that transparent so that writing doesn't just seem like this mysterious thing that either you've got it or you don't. So overall, I think what we've learned is that the more able writers are able to build this shared context with an imagined reader, particularly using the kind of language that I was talking about, the language that enables them to bring other perspectives into their argument, that they're better able to focus on the process of the argument to actually make the moves that are inherent in an argument, that they can negotiate their claims better with a critical reader, and they're using more of the academic register. This obviously is work very much in progress, and so where we think we're headed, we certainly need to do some additional analysis of the subcorpora that we have, and of course the goal is ultimately to be looking across multiple years to follow subsets of students who fall into designated categories. For example, we have this growing population on campus of Generation 1.5, which none of us knows enough about, a population of students who are not international students, but who have had extended tutelage in a language not English, and probably graduated from a high school in the US, but may not have full command of English, particularly in its written form, and they are not easy to identify, and they're even harder to help. And so part of what we need to do is, I think, to figure out better how we can identify these students and help them identify themselves, and how we can then how we can use the data that we have to learn more about how we can help them, and to get fuller portraits of students, because the wonderful thing about working at this university is that we have tremendous data to call upon, and so we can create even fuller portraits. As some of you know, we've just instituted a minor in writing at Sweetland, and so we're going to have a population of students who are going to be able to follow very closely over at least 2 years. And of course, my fond hope is that we're also going to be able to follow many subgroups of students across multiple years, and again, get longitudinal pictures of what writing development looks like for different kinds of populations. And ultimately, and finally, why we're all here, is to help students learn and to use the research that we're drawing upon and developing to inform the teaching that we do. So there it is, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Great. Questions from the audience?
Mark, it was all, everything you're doing, the Sweetland Center, I guess, seems like you focus entirely on undergraduate students.
No?
And in terms of the discussion today?
Oh, in terms of today, yeah. But I don't want anyone to leave this room thinking that Sweetland does only undergraduates. Right.
And I was just curious as to how you're thinking about the same sort of, our matriculating graduate students. And how do we think about that? We have a lot of writing challenges there, too.
We do. And we are thinking about that. We haven't done the same kind of extensive research, but we work with graduate students in a variety of capacities and are constantly trying to figure out how we can do more, because I agree with you, there are enormous issues there.
I was fascinated by your online assignment, essentially, that you had the undergraduates doing, and I was wondering how difficult it would be to try to do that for all of our entering graduate students, and how automated your assessment was so that you could come back with the sort of data you were just showing us.
Some of it we could do pretty easily, but again, part of what I hope I've conveyed here is that I think assessment always has to be pretty context sensitive, and so we could come up with a general scheme, but I think it would take inevitably disciplinary initiative, because particularly at the graduate level, we're talking about pretty narrow disciplinary parameters. But I think it's possible. We could talk about something like that. Of course.
I wanted to ask a little bit more about the question: do you think you made the right choice for the students that were in the Writing 100 class?
I'm sorry?
The question: do you think you made the right choice?
Oh, right.
That shows up for the survey of the Writing 100 students. It looked like just under a third of the students answered no.
Right.
So I was curious to know if you had more information on why they felt that that was not the right placement, what things could be done to help those students, those types of students find the right placement, and also if there was a comparable survey for first year students placed into first year who took first year writing to see if they felt that they had been in the right placement.
You're asking good questions. Yes and yes. We do survey multiple versions of students. And the truth is we don't have as good data yet on the students who don't feel that this was a good choice for them. So that is something we need to learn more about. Yeah, sure.
And I've got a question that relates to advising, since that's part of what I have to do. One of the things we hear from our students during orientation after they've written your essay, but they don't have any feedback yet, is that they would like to get some feedback to help them make the decision about whether they're going to be taking the first year writing class or the Writing 100 class. And I'm wondering if at some point you can use this this enormous pool of data that you've collected to create some tools that will allow you to give us some feedback right away to students. I know it takes a while to make a truly meaningful assessment of any piece of writing, but if there's something that you could build, give students some quick feedback right away, either to confirm or contradict how they're feeling about their confidence level, because that's all they have to go on.
Right.
During a
I have sort of two answers, because part of me resists the idea of going in that direction, because the principle of directed self-placement is that part of what we want students to do is to own their own learning and own their own capacities as writers. And the idea of having this experience where they're looking at something, having to do a writing task, should be giving them some indication about their capacities as writers. And I think that's really central in learning, that one's ability to do some self-assessment is something we want to develop. So I have to hesitate there. The other thing to say is that it would be possible to do the worst kind of evaluation, which is the kind that, I'm sure many of you know, there is a growing, enormous industry in this country right now of machine scoring of writing, which is what I mean when I say the worst kind of evaluation. And I want to be really clear to say that the kind of analysis that we're doing is in no way intended to go down that road. because it seems to me it leaves out exactly what we want in student writing, which is the rhetorical sense, which is not just, I mean, what computers do really well is count things. And so they can come up with algorithms and you know, word counts of all kinds, but at the end of the day, it can be gibberish, and the computer isn't going to discern that.
Before we move on from that claim, it seems like exactly the kind of thing that this group could argue about in a very interesting way for a little while.
Well, it's true.
I want to invite us to do that, if that's okay with you.
Sounds good to me.
No, I think you're right.
Yeah. So if people, I mean, I'm happy to make a claim, but I'd rather somebody else does who feels strongly about it too. So I just wanted to put it out there.
Sure.
You get the first claim, you put it out, make a claim.
Yeah.
Without disagreeing with you directly, because I get your underlying point, I think it's an important point. Techniques like latent semantic analysis seem to actually, on the surface, do a pretty good job of identifying at least categories of writing, right?
Yeah.
Of saying, these are the best essays, these are the second best essays, and so forth. And I didn't know what you were going to talk about today. I imagined it might have been that very topic. But this is great too.
Thanks.
And I'm just curious as to, I mean, I'm not aware of anyone at Michigan who's using those kinds of tools yet.
No.
But I know many of my colleagues at other peer institutions who are. And I'm curious as to where we might be headed with that, or if anyone knows of people on campus who are going in that direction on their own.
I don't know. Does anybody know?
Actually, I wonder if you could explain it just in a couple of sentences, that the tool that you're thinking of.
Well, I'm not thinking of a specific tool, but a technique called latent semantic analysis
Right.
does essentially what Anna's suggesting. It
Yeah.
counts, and it has a huge corpus of text that has already been ranked or rated, much in the way you were talking about the scoring of essays by pools of human raters. And it can, what the analysis does at a very simple level is say, how similar structurally is this piece of writing to a piece of writing or a huge corpus of writing that I already know something about?
Yeah.
And then with a probability, makes a judgment. Is that a fair description for
Yeah,
people who may
yeah.
know even more about it?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I think that's very fair. And there's no question that there are many people in the world who are headed down that road.
So I just wanted to, I mean, if people aren't interested in this, we can move on. But
So if there are people here who have iPhone 4Ss,
Yep.
you've been speaking with Siri,
Yep.
there's some natural language processing going on that's very sort of sophisticated. And that's what these systems are headed toward. It's hard to believe that she can answer your questions the way that she does. So.
Yeah. Hey, Diana.
So this, I don't want to go off your nice pedestal there, but when the question was asked about student feedback, I wonder if you thought of something as basic as, here is a model, we could do, we could show a model response afterwards and let the sophistication of the student figure out, oh, did what I write match up with these little model passages?
That's a brilliant idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you are if you're standing back from them because it's online and somebody else is going to write it and their buddy's going to also apply for Michigan, or
Right.
I mean, are you afraid?
No, I that's the least of my worries. I mean, if I worried about that, I would have to worry about every paper that every student hands into me all the time, because I do know there are very high-paid people who are writing people's papers here at this university, and
Easy, unfortunately.
I'm already interested in very highly paid.
there you go. But no, that's actually a very interesting idea, and it sort of again plays into the kind of assessment that I hope we'll continue to pay attention to, which is one that is connected to real things that students are actually going to do, and comparing their writing to somebody else's is a pretty reasonable thing to do. So thank you. Yeah.
Well, slightly on those lines, and It also actually reminded me of the comment you made right at the start about access versus rigor, and the comments that you made about the academic register, if you want to call it that. Because I wonder to what extent any kind of system like this is then open to the immediate obvious tactic of basically publishing a list of words. Use these words, right? Claims, suggests.
Yeah.
Don't use these words, I think, I believe. And, I think that a reader, again, and not at all to disparage the machine sort of scoring of writing, but ultimately the test of writing is that someone reads it and says this argument makes sense or this argument doesn't make sense, regardless of the register that it's written in.
Right.
So I just wondered to what extent that was informing your decision of how to move forwards with this kind of work.
No, I think you raise a really good point, and I would never want to suggest that the outcome of our work should be handing out lists of words that students should and should not use, because I think we can all point to very good examples of arguments made in non-academic registers. But it's also the case that for some of the students that we're looking at, the academic register is not even something on the radar yet. And I think as teachers, we have a responsibility to help them understand multiple registers. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, I think so. I guess I was wondering to what extent you sort of viewed that as something that would, say you're looking at results going forward. Say eventually you look at a timeline of results and we have these scores over multiple years, whether you would then already be thinking of, well, this might be influenced by the fact that people are now learning to essentially conform to a specific test.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a very likely possibility. And then another thing that I think we'd have to look at is how it looks across disciplines, because that's something that we, the larger profession, don't have much sense of. What does a good writer in history look like compared with a good writer in biology?
Did you do much breaking down your 3,000 students by interest, for example?
No, and see that's,
That would be really interesting
yeah,
to look
there's
at.
so many ways that we can look at this data. There's just a lot to do.
Do you notice any differences between different types of first-year writing courses that students selected, the English versions versus history or Slavic studies, just through sort of the data that you collected? If there are patterns of differences or performance or even...
I'm sorry, I'm not able to hear.
I'm curious about the differences between the students who elected, say, English 124 or 125 versus the history version of first-year writing and Slavic studies.
Right, yeah.
If you have any data of why they selected those and then how they did in relationship to...
That's a really interesting question, because we do have this multiplicity of, so the question, in case you couldn't hear it either, is do we have data on the differences between the students who took the English version of first-year writing versus, say, the Slavic or the classics? And at this point, we have the data, we haven't analyzed it, but it is doable. There just aren't enough hours in the day. And it is a really interesting question. Yeah.
I was curious how the essays are being used. You said they're being used, incorporated into instruction, and there's students' first year courses. So how is that being done? How are all of these different courses incorporating this, bilateral essay back in?
In many, many different ways. And again, we're surveying students and instructors to try to understand more fully what they are doing. So we're giving them lots of suggestions and materials that they can use and ideas and so forth. And then we're trying to find out at the other end. But obviously, we can't know fully what we're talking such big numbers of classes. We are not scrutinizing everybody's class. Naomi?
Some examples. would be students are, or instructors are, say, asking students to look at their essay at the beginning of the semester to set goals for their writing for the term, or at the end of the semester to see how their writing has progressed since the beginning. So for kind of assessment and diagnostic purposes there. And some are using the essays as modeling for how to write. So looking at introductions or looking at how a thesis statement is constructed in these DSP essays and using that as a way to help students with their own writing in the course. So it's a range of ways. Sometimes they were just talking about them in office hours in terms of setting goals. But,
Does that answer your question?
I can add too that we're also, we've been working to get a lot of instructor input when we're selecting the article and asking instructors to recommend articles they've encountered they think would be good and help us with the prompt. So as a way to be engaging instructors in that process to help make it something that will be more relevant for their courses as well.
So the prompt changes every year?
Yes, yeah. Because otherwise your sister and his brother would just send us the same essay.
I think that's a great way to figure out what to do with data. Give it to all the instructors at Michigan.
That's
See
right.
what they do. And somebody will come up with a great idea, right? And then you'll have so this is a lovely example because there's so many different instructors in a parallel path. It's really nice.
Right.
Find out. All right, well, let's thank Anne. If you have more questions, please come up and ask.
Okay. Thank you.